I didn't believe it when I saw her. Not in the dramatic sense. Not in a movie scene way. I mean, my mind simply rejected the image in front of me, the way it rejects bad news before the words finish forming. I remember thinking, this is a wedding. My son's wedding. I've done everything right today. I showed up. I stayed calm. I stayed in my lane. Whatever problems life still has for me, they're not supposed to be waiting in this room. So no, this couldn't be her. I'm 60 years old. By that age, denial doesn't announce itself. It slips in quietly and rearranges reality so you can keep breathing. I told myself I was tired. I told myself all women with light hair start to look the same in warm lighting. I told myself memory fills in gaps that don't exist anymore. Anything except the obvious truth standing across the room, close enough to matter. I came to my son's wedding with a rule. One rule. Don't reopen anything. Not today. This wasn't about me anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. I'd already practiced my role in my head during the drive over. Sit where you're told. Smile when expected. Shake hands. Say how proud you are. Leave before emotions start leaking out in places you can't control. Men my age are allowed to exit quietly. People call it dignity. I've learned it's often just fear with better posture. I stood near the back of the reception hall holding a paper cup of coffee I didn't want. I watched my son laugh with his friends, watched the woman he married touch his arm like she'd been doing it forever. That part was comforting. He was fine. Better than fine. Whatever mistakes his mother and I had made, he hadn't inherited them the way I once feared. Then my eyes drifted back to the side table near the wall. And that's when I noticed the way she stood. Straight. Unapologetic. As if she'd finally stopped trying to shrink herself for the comfort of others. Faces change with time. Bodies change. But posture tells the truth. And that posture belonged to someone I had once loved and later convinced myself I'd forgotten. I felt resistance rise in my chest. Not longing. Not regret. Resistance. Like my body was pushing back against something it knew could still hurt. I thought, this isn't fair. Of all days. Of all rooms. I'd managed birthdays, holidays, graduations. We'd learned how to orbit the same events without colliding. Why now? She didn't approach me right away. That made it worse. It gave my mind time to search for exits. I could leave. Slip out before the speeches. Claim a headache. No one would question it. A man my age disappearing from a wedding is expected behavior. We're allowed to be fragile without explanation. I told myself she wouldn't come over. Too public. Too many eyes. We'd both learned restraint the hard way. Or at least I thought we had. The music softened. Chairs scraped lightly against the floor. Glasses clinked. And then she was beside me. Not blocking my view. Not demanding attention. Just close enough that I caught a trace of her perfume, familiar in a way that tightened something low in my chest before I could stop it. Can we talk? She whispered. No hello. No how have you been? Just that. For a second, I considered pretending I hadn't heard her. Silence has saved me more times than honesty ever did. I kept my eyes forward, fixed on a couple posing for photos. In my head, one voice said, this is a mistake. Another voice, quieter and far more dangerous, said, you've been avoiding this longer than you admit. I thought about my son. About the way he'd looked at me earlier, nervous, proud, still checking even now whether I approved of the life he was stepping into. I thought about the promise I'd made myself that morning in the hotel mirror. Don't complicate things. Don't bring the past into his day. Some moments don't allow rewinds, and this was one of them. If he saw us together like this, there would be no explanation later. That was the choice. Simple. Brutal. I could say no and protect the careful image I'd built over years. The calm father, the reasonable ex-husband, the man who knew when to stay out of the way. Or I could acknowledge her and accept whatever consequences followed. There are moments when neither option feels like dignity. One preserves appearances. The other risks the truth. I finally turned and looked at her. Up close, the years were visible on both of us. Lines earned, not apologized for. Her expression wasn't hopeful. It wasn't pleading. It was steady, like she'd already made peace with whatever answer I gave. That somehow made it harder. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I stood up. Sometimes silence isn't avoidance. Sometimes it's the moment you stop pretending you don't hear what's being asked. I realized something was wrong the moment the doors closed behind us. Not wrong in a dramatic way. Wrong in the quiet, irreversible sense. The music from the reception didn't disappear. It thinned out like something alive but no longer paying attention to me. And for the first time that evening, I became aware of how this might look if someone stepped into the hallway and saw us standing there together. Two people who were supposed to be finished, suddenly not finished at all. I should have stopped then. I didn't. She walked a few steps ahead of me and stopped near a tall window at the end of the corridor. Outside, the parking lot lights had come on, washing everything in that pale yellow glow that makes cars look older than they are. She didn't turn around right away. She gave me distance, space, and somehow that made the moment heavier, not lighter. "I won't take long," she said. Her voice wasn't cautious. It wasn't emotional either. Just steady. And that unsettled me more than anger ever would have. When someone is calm, it usually means they've already said the hard parts to themselves. I told myself I was still in control. That I could end this with one sentence. Something polite. Something final. Go back inside before my son noticed I was gone. But even as I thought that, I understood the uncomfortable truth. I had already crossed a line simply by being there. You don't follow someone into a quiet hallway at your son's wedding by accident. She turned then and looked at me properly. No nostalgia in her eyes. No rehearsed emotion. Just recognition. As if she were seeing who I actually was now, not the man she once argued with, not the man I'd spent years distancing myself from in memory. "You look tired," she said. It wasn't a criticism. It wasn't sympathy. It was an observation. And it landed because it was accurate in a way I hadn't admitted to myself. I nodded once. Saying more felt risky. We stood there longer than necessary. The silence stretched, not awkward but loaded. And then she said the thing I hadn't prepared for. "I didn't leave because we fought," she said. "I left because I disappeared next to you." That was it. No build-up. No explanation wrapped around it. Just a sentence placed carefully between us, like something fragile she'd been carrying for years. My first instinct was physical. I shifted my weight. My chest tightened. I had the sudden irrational urge to step back toward the door. Toward noise. Toward witnesses. Away from a sentence that didn't accuse me of anything, and somehow did exactly that. I almost ended it right there. I could feel the words lining up. We were both at fault. That was a long time ago. You're remembering it wrong. Men my age learn these phrases the way we learn where we left our keys. Out of habit. Out of survival. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the lack of anger in her voice. Or maybe it was the realization that I'd spent years believing I understood why she left without ever actually hearing it from her. "I didn't feel like I mattered when things went quiet," she went on. "And things were always quiet with you." The music from the reception floated down the hall. Laughter. Applause. Someone clinking a glass. Life moving forward without any regard for what was happening 30 feet away. I thought about how easily I could step back into that world and pretend this conversation had never happened. That was the choice. Not whether to agree with her. Not whether to defend myself. The real choice was whether I was willing to listen without correcting the story in my head. I opened my mouth then closed it again. I realized, with a flash of discomfort, how often silence had been my solution. At work. At home. With my son. I'd called it patience. Restraint. Maturity. But standing there, those words felt thinner than they used to. "I always thought I was giving space," I said finally. My voice sounded older than I expected. "I thought that was the right thing." She nodded once. "I know. But space feels different when you're the only one standing in it." That was worse than an argument. Worse than blame. Because it wasn't something I could push back against. It wasn't an attack. It was a description. "I'm not here to reopen anything," she said, almost as if she sensed the direction my thoughts were going. "I just didn't want to carry this anymore." That sentence stayed with me. Carry this. Not you hurt me. Not you failed me. Just the weight of something unfinished. I realized then that this conversation wasn't about fixing the past. It was about whether I would do what I'd always done when faced with discomfort. Withdraw quietly and call it dignity. From somewhere behind us, I heard my son's name. Someone calling for him. Someone needing him. The pull was immediate. Instinctive. That was my place. That was where I belonged. And yet, for the first time, walking away felt less like responsibility and more like repetition. I stayed where I was. Not because I knew what to say next, but because I finally understood what it cost me every time I didn't. The first thing that broke the moment wasn't a voice. It was movement. A shadow crossing the hallway entrance, brief but unmistakable. Someone passing by. Someone close enough to remind me that we weren't alone, no matter how quiet it felt. That's when it hit me, not as a thought but as a physical jolt, that this conversation had consequences beyond the two of us. At a wedding, nothing exists in isolation. Especially not history. I straightened without meaning to. Old habit. The kind you develop when you've spent decades learning how to look harmless, neutral, appropriate. I glanced toward the doors leading back to the reception, half expecting to see my son standing there, scanning the room for me. The idea tightened something in my chest. Not fear for myself. Fear of becoming a distraction on the one day he deserved none. She noticed the shift immediately. "You don't have to stay," she said quietly. That made it worse. If she demanded anything, time, answers, emotion, I might have resisted on instinct. But permission? That removed the last excuse. I could leave and call it maturity. Or I could stay and risk being seen as the man who couldn't keep his past in check. This was the pressure I hadn't accounted for. Not memory. Not emotion. Visibility. We walked a few steps farther down the hall, stopping near a framed photograph of the venue in winter, empty and pristine. The irony wasn't lost on me. Places always look simpler without people in them. I became acutely aware of how this might look. Two older figures, heads inclined toward each other. Not inappropriate. Just suggestive enough to raise questions. Weddings are fueled by curiosity. People notice patterns. They connect dots whether the dots belong together or not. "I should go back," I said finally. The words came out flatter than I intended. She didn't argue. She just looked at me. And in that look was something I hadn't seen before. Not disappointment. Not hope. Recognition of the same risk from the other side. She understood exactly what was at stake because she was carrying it too. "I know," she said. "I wouldn't have asked if it didn't matter." That was the moment the fear sharpened. Not fear of her. Fear of being misunderstood. Of being reduced to a story someone else would tell later. Of hearing my name followed by a lowered voice. Of watching my son's smile falter even for a second because of something I failed to manage. You reach a point in life where reputation isn't about ego anymore. It's about not becoming a burden. We stood there while the noise from the reception ebbed and flowed like a tide. I caught fragments, laughter, clapping, a microphone squeal. Normal sounds, safe sounds. I could step back into them at any moment and this hallway would close behind me like it never existed. "This is where I usually stop," I said more to myself than to her. "Before things get complicated." She nodded slowly. "I know. You always did." That landed harder than anything she'd said before. Because it wasn't an accusation. It was an observation backed by history. I felt the familiar urge to justify myself. To explain that stopping early had kept the peace. That boundaries mattered. That some doors were better left unopened. All the things I'd told myself while quietly stepping away from moments that demanded more. Then something happened I hadn't expected. From the reception hall, I heard my son's voice. Not calling for me. Laughing. Clear and unburdened. It reminded me why I was there in the first place. It also reminded me how easily that sound could change if I handled this wrong. That was the antagonist in that moment. Not a person. A possibility. The possibility of becoming a source of discomfort in my own child's memory of this day. "I can't do this here," I said. The firmness surprised me. Her expression didn't change, but I saw the understanding settle in. She nodded once, as if confirming something she'd already accepted. "I didn't expect you to," she replied. There was no relief in that answer. No victory. Just a quiet acknowledgement of limits. I took a step back toward the doors. Every instinct told me this was the right move. Responsible. Controlled. The version of me that had survived by staying unobtrusive felt validated. And yet, something else lingered. A thin, unsettling awareness that by choosing safety now, I was also choosing familiarity. The same pattern. The same ending. "I need to think," I added. A half-truth but an honest one. She met my eyes. "That's all I wanted you to do." I turned away before the weight of that sentence could settle any deeper. As I reached for the handle, my hand paused. Not long enough to be noticed. Long enough to register doubt. When I stepped back into the reception, the noise rushed to meet me. Conversations resumed their rhythm. Someone clapped me on the shoulder. Someone handed me a drink. I smiled. I played my part. But the ease I'd expected never came. Because now I knew what it cost to walk away, and that knowledge didn't disappear with the music. I thought the hardest part would be the waiting. That's what people usually say, right? That distance hurts more than words. But standing there afterward, back in the reception hall, surrounded by noise I could no longer feel, I realized waiting wasn't the problem. The problem was certainty. The certainty that I'd made the safe choice. And the quiet suspicion that safety and correctness aren't always the same thing. I moved through the rest of the evening on autopilot. Smiles came when they were expected. My son hugged me, warm and distracted, already pulled forward by his new life. I told him how proud I was. I meant it. That part was easy. Everything else felt slightly misaligned, like I was wearing someone else's jacket. Close enough to pass but not quite mine. I kept scanning the room without meaning to. Not searching exactly. Just noticing absences. Corners she wasn't in. Conversations she wasn't part of. At some point, I told myself she'd probably already left. That made sense. Clean ending. The kind I'd always preferred. I left not long after the cake was cut. Early enough to be respectable. Late enough not to draw attention. In the parking lot, the air felt cooler than I expected, sharp in my lungs. I sat in the car for a minute before starting the engine, hands resting on the steering wheel, replaying nothing in particular. Just the feeling. The one I couldn't name. Driving back to the hotel, the road was almost empty. Streetlights passed in steady intervals, each one marking time in a way clocks never quite manage. I should have felt relief. The tension was over. The situation had been handled. No scenes. No damage. Instead, something kept pressing at me. Not regret exactly. Regret implies a desire to undo. This felt different. Like recognizing a pattern you followed your whole life and suddenly seeing where it ends. Back in my room, I loosened my tie and sat on the edge of the bed without turning on the lights. The quiet there wasn't heavy. It was honest. No music behind it. No audience. Just me and the echo of a choice that had felt right in the moment and increasingly thin now that it was done. This was the part one knew well. Distance. I'd always trusted distance. It made things manageable. Gave emotions time to settle into something predictable. I told myself she'd said what she needed to say. That was the point, wasn't it? Closure. I'd listened. That had to count for something. But the more I sat with it, the less convinced I became. Because what she'd said wasn't about the past. Not really. It was about a habit. A way of moving through life that avoided friction at the cost of connection. And once you see that, you start noticing it everywhere. I thought about my job years ago when speaking up would have meant conflict and staying quiet meant stability. I chose quiet. I thought about friendships that faded not because of arguments, but because I never reached out first. I thought about my son, moments when he'd looked at me as if waiting for more than I was offering. I'd always told myself this was who I was. Calm. Reasonable. Not dramatic. And in many ways that was true. But it was also incomplete. Sometime after midnight, I heard a knock on the door. Not loud. Not hesitant. Just firm enough to demand attention without urgency. My first thought was irritation. I wasn't expecting anyone. My second thought came immediately after, unwanted but undeniable. I didn't open the door right away. I stood there for a moment, hand on the handle, the hallway light spilling in through the crack beneath it. This was another choice. Smaller than the one at the wedding. Private. Consequence contained. I could ignore it. Pretend I hadn't heard. Continue the night the way I'd planned, alone, unresolved, familiar. Or I could open the door and risk learning something about myself I couldn't unknow. When I finally did open it, she stood there with her coat on, hair slightly windblown, expression calm but tired. Not hopeful. Not reproachful. Just present. I didn't mean to intrude, she said. I just realized if I didn't come now, I never would. That sentence landed differently than anything else she'd said all night. Not dramatic. Practical. Honest. We didn't hug. We didn't step into each other's space. She stayed just inside the doorway light, giving me the option to end this with a word. I'm not here to change anything, she continued. I just needed you to know something. I waited. I didn't rush her. For once, silence felt like room rather than escape. When I said I disappeared next to you, she said, I wasn't asking you to fix that. I just needed you to hear it. Because I spent years thinking it meant I wasn't enough. And it didn't. It meant we were standing in different places, facing different directions. That was the hidden motive. Not reconciliation. Not forgiveness. Clarity. For both of us. I felt something loosen in my chest. Not relief. Recognition. She smiled, small and tired. You didn't fail. But you did leave every time it got uncomfortable. And I needed to stop carrying that as my own flaw. I nodded slowly. There was nothing to argue with there. No defense that didn't sound like habit. She took a step back then, already preparing to go. And suddenly, the distance I'd relied on for so long felt less like protection and more like loss. I had one more choice in front of me. To thank her politely and close the door. Or to acknowledge the truth she just handed me, even if I didn't yet know what to do with it. Thank you, I said. And meant more than the word usually carries. She held my gaze for a moment, then nodded once and walked down the hallway. I closed the door and leaned my forehead against it, eyes shut. For the first time that night, the quiet didn't feel like safety. It felt like something waiting to be answered. I woke up earlier than I needed to. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the absence of the familiar urge to distract myself. No reaching for the phone. No turning on the television for background noise. I lay there, staring at the ceiling of the hotel room, aware of my breathing, aware of time passing without resistance. It felt like something had shifted during the night, not dramatically, not cleanly, but enough that I couldn't pretend nothing had happened. By morning, the wedding was already becoming a memory. The hotel hallway was quiet. Checkout carts rolled softly over the carpet. People were leaving, returning to lives that hadn't been interrupted the way mine had. I packed slowly. Not because I was indecisive, but because I didn't feel the need to rush back into old momentum. Driving home, the road stretched out in front of me like it always had. Familiar exits. Familiar signs. The kind of drive you can do without thinking. But for the first time in a long while, my thoughts didn't circle back to the same justifications. I wasn't replaying the conversation to defend myself. I wasn't editing her words into something easier to carry. I let them sit as they were. That alone told me something had changed. I stopped once for coffee at a place I'd passed 100 times before. Same counter. Same worn menu board. I sat by the window and watched people come and go. Couples. Individuals. A man about my age waiting alone, checking his watch too often. I recognized the posture. The habit of filling space with patience. I thought about how many decisions in my life hadn't felt like decisions at all. They'd felt like defaults. Silence. Distance. Choosing the option that caused the least disruption in the moment. I'd always believed that meant I was being considerate. I was keeping things stable. Now I wondered who I'd been considerate of. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I knew this wasn't about her anymore. Not really. She had done what she came to do. She'd told the truth without demanding a response. She'd left me with something that didn't belong to her anymore. Inside the house, everything was exactly where I'd left it. Shoes by the door. Mail stacked neatly. The quiet I usually welcomed wrapped around me like it always had. Only this time it didn't feel neutral. It felt like a question. I put my keys down and stood there for a moment longer than necessary. There was no one watching. No one to impress. No one to disappoint. Just me and the familiar comfort of staying exactly as I was. That's when I felt the choice settle in, not sharply, not urgently, but with a weight I couldn't ignore. I could move forward the way I always had. Tell myself this weekend was an anomaly. A late reckoning I'd acknowledged and survived. Or I could accept that something fundamental had been named, and that naming it carried responsibility. I didn't call her. Not because I was avoiding her. Because I didn't need to. This wasn't about reopening anything. It was about not closing myself off again under the excuse of maturity. Instead, I called my son. Not to talk about the wedding. Not to mention his mother. I asked how the drive had been. How they were settling in. I listened when he talked. Really listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't offer advice he hadn't asked for. When the silence came, I didn't rush to fill it. At one point, he paused and said, "Everything okay, Dad?" And there it was. A simple question. No suspicion. No concern. Just space. "Yes," I said. And for once, it wasn't a deflection. I think it is. After the call ended, I sat there for a long time. Not frozen. Not stuck. Just present. I thought about the man I'd been for most of my life. Calm. Reliable. Reasonable. Those weren't lies. But they weren't the whole truth either. I'd confused not making waves with being honest. I treated silence like neutrality, when in reality it had been making decisions on my behalf. That realization didn't come with regret. It came with clarity. I didn't know what I would do differently yet. Change doesn't announce itself with instructions. It starts with awareness, and that's often the most uncomfortable part. Later that afternoon, I found myself standing in the kitchen, staring out the window. Same view. Same quiet neighborhood. A life that hadn't collapsed or demanded reinvention. Just a subtle shift in how I occupied it. I thought about all the times I'd stepped back and told myself it was the right thing. And how often that had been true. And how often it hadn't. There are no guarantees at this stage of life. No grand arcs. No promises that things will feel lighter just because you've noticed something heavy. But there is choice. Even now. Not the dramatic kind. The small, unremarkable kind. The decision to stay in conversations that feel slightly uncomfortable. To speak when silence would be easier. To risk being misunderstood rather than invisible. That night, when I turned off the lights, the house felt quiet in a different way. Not empty, not protective, just quiet. And lying there, I didn't ask myself what the future held. I asked something simpler. How many moments in my life had I mistaken silence for peace? And how many of them was I still willing to let decide for me?